Welcome to another episode of Policy Gone Viral. I'm Andrea O'Sullivan, Director of the Center for Technology and Innovation at the James Madison Institute. And today we have Bartlett Cleland with us to talk about connectivity in the age of COVID-19. Bartlett is a familiar face in tech policy, having served as the Chief Strategy and Innovation Officer for the American Legislative Exchange Council, the Technology and Policy Council for Americans for Tax Reform, and he's also served as a research fellow with the Institute for Policy Innovation in Texas and the Pacific Research Institute in California. Today, he is the managing director of Maderi Bridge Associates, which is a public strategy firm for public policy, and he has also written a lot for JMI on tech policy issues in the past, including his most recent journal article, which we're going to talk about today. It's so great to have you with us, Bartlett.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate you.
Of course. So let's talk a little bit about the article you wrote for us, which is a very relevant issue in tech policy today, especially as we're still reeling with the effects of this pandemic. We might unfortunately be seeing a second wave, so technologies that keep us connected are more important than ever. You recently wrote for us about how central FCC broadband policy has been in keeping us connected while we've been distant during COVID. And so far, the FCC has actually done a pretty good job. Can you tell us a little bit about the Keep Americans Connected pledge that the FCC was involved with and how that affected the increased broadband needs that we've seen?
Sure. Again, thank you for having me. And to set the table briefly, the FCC has been doing several years of work now, broadening its approach, so to speak, of what does it mean to have a healthy telecommunications / technology ecosystem. Because of that, and because of the leadership that they've had, largely letting markets dictate what needs to go on as opposed to regulator whims, the table was set for a environment where there was robust investment. What does that mean? Robust investment in infrastructure for telecommunications means all the things that you and I enjoy: faster, better, more ubiquitous broadband. So you can now, most people listening to this podcast probably remember not long ago, if you walked into a mall or the back of a grocery store, for example, your Wi-Fi may have dropped. This is becoming an increasingly rare event. You might recall driving down a rural road somewhere and not being able to connect, an increasingly rare event. This is all because of the infrastructure investment that's been made. Now advance us to the pandemic. So we have a situation where I think it's safe to say no one expected everyone in the country would be forced to work at their homes, and yet they were. And why does that matter? Because if you think about how broadband use typically happens during a workday, it's not unlike, say, air conditioning use. If you look at energy use patterns, it all focuses in the city during the day, and then towards the evening, it kind of spreads out and then reverse, etc. So broadband unexpectedly had to follow that same pattern in hyperdrive, or reverse pattern, I should say, where everyone's at home all the time doing Zoom calls, doing all kinds of connectivity, and yet our system performed very well. Why did that happen? In part, it was because of the building, but in part, FCC leadership and what the chairman sought to do was to make sure that everyone would have access, exactly foreseeing what was happening as it was happening at the beginning and what would be needed, hence the Keep America Connected pledge. And it's a variety of actions, but that basically comes down to this. It asks broadband providers to continue providing broadband for customers, and sometimes people who were not even customers, for as long as the pandemic might go on. Now, there were dates set. Most of those dates have been ignored, to the credit of industry, who have stepped up and continued to provide broadband. The first several months, there were no, if you couldn't afford your broadband, you stayed connected. There was building out into new areas, and broadband being provided to people who didn't have broadband in the first place. So billions of dollars spent by industry, largely because of the leadership of the FCC, not just now, but for the last several years, that allowed all this predicate building to get to where we are today.
Sure. Yeah, and I think the leadership at FCC has been so important, and it's not typical that an FCC chairman would be a household name, but that is kind of the case with Ajit Pai, who's been there for a few years now. And the reason he's so well known was the big debate over what is commonly called net neutrality, but what in terms of policy was the extension of what's called Title II to internet service providers. And he got a lot of heat for this at the time. People said we would have to pay per web page and just all kinds of doom and gloom scenarios. But in retrospect, it looks like that leadership created an environment where we did have the investment. And we can compare that to an environment like that in Europe, which does have these kind of Title II regulations that we thankfully didn't have here. Can you talk a little bit about Europe's experience with the pandemic and the connectivity issues that they've had as compared to the US?
Sure. So Title II, net neutrality, easily boiled down, is essentially heavy-handed regulations on the internet. So the internet as imagined by your favorite federal government. That was rejected by the current FCC, but by the FCC in general, not just the current one previously, but fought back against a more recent era of the FCC before Chairman Pai was there, and decided that the right way to go and the right precedent and the right understanding of the law is handed to them by Congress was in fact to have light touch regulation. So we're not talking about a regulatory free zone. We're not talking about the Wild West. We're talking about light touch regulation only when and where necessary. So that framework architecture is, first of all, one reason that the investment has been so rampant, because industry was able to see their way to more subscriptions, et cetera, more growth and more income. And so they invested. And in part, a happy consumer is a consumer that when they paid for broadband is receiving broadband, of course. So if you're going to get a new subscriber, you certainly want to provide them with your best product. So industry was incented to build out their systems exactly that way. In Europe, it was different. In Europe, they have effectively Title II net neutrality regulation. That is a heavier handed government intervention into the internet space. That means you're playing a lot of Mother May I when it comes to innovation, a lot of Mother May I when it comes to investment, where you can grow your system, how quickly you can grow your system, et cetera. So what did that all mean when we get to the pandemic? Well, I've already explained what happened here. Not only were systems already prepared for the influx of activity that it saw, but in addition, the regulator, because in this case, the regulator had been working, I'll say, with industry, small w, small I, as opposed to standing in its way, the systems worked very well. In Europe, that didn't happen. In fact, in Europe, everything that was predicted that was going to happen if we didn't do net neutrality here is precisely what did happen in Europe during the pandemic. There couldn't be a better case study of why we shouldn't have heavy-handed regulation on the internet and telecommunications than this pandemic. So in the EU, what did they do? Providers via the government had to restrict service, and that's what happened. Here in the US, as I explained just a moment ago, they expanded service. Proof is in the pudding.
Yeah, that is so important. And most kind of hope that Europe kind of learns from that case study, because it doesn't have to be like that. And even in the US, we've done a great job, but there's still more we can do. There are some people in, perhaps rural areas that have connectivity issues, or, as more and more people purchase more and more devices and even, higher speed devices, we're going to still have more people needing to access connectivity. So your article talks about some key steps that the FCC could take to expand our connectivity even more. For instance, auctioning more mid-band spectrum and fast-tracking 5G cell installation. Can you talk more about these ideas and how that would help us weather these even, future significant demands on our telecom infrastructure?
Absolutely. So you're right. There are pockets. There are people in this country who still don't have access to broadband, and that can't be overlooked, particularly these days when we see that we're depending on broadband to be school, to be access to school, to be access to health. And whether you like what's going on with school online or not, the fact of the matter is that a lot of the country has depended on that being the way to talk to kids. A lot of the country has been depending on that as a way to talk to those who need to reach a doctor. And so the urgency of making sure everyone has access to broadband has increased. There are the instinct of some is to immediately say, aha, well, now this this finally is the place where we show you that government should in fact have heavy-handed regulations and should in fact require industry to service everybody. But that isn't the answer. It almost never is, of course. The answer is truly to help get government out of the way, to remove the barriers that it might have in place to expanding broadband, and then to urge it to hurry up in places where needed. So you mentioned spectrum. Broadly speaking, the spectrum is a raw ingredient, a raw material to building out a communication system. Without more spectrum, you can't offer as much broadband or as good of broadband or broadband in all the same places that you could. Um, so so what does that have to do with the FCC? Well, the FCC is the agency that oversees how spectrum gets distributed, and typically through auctions. And so there is a need for the FCC to continue moving forward with a what has been, frankly, in the last several years, a great pattern, a great pathway of auctions. But we need a plan, a very clear plan for going forward, particularly in mid-band spectrum. And what does that mean? Sounds wonky, is kind of wonky. Mid-band spectrum, think of it as waterfront property, beachfront property. The best you could have, the distance that you can go in mid-band spectrum, and with the quality, including being able to penetrate walls, et cetera, is the best balance in mid-band spectrum. Hence the need for more mid-band spectrum to get auctioned and have a plan to get it to auction. It takes a while for these things to happen. And that has continued and is underway, perhaps could move more quickly, and probably necessarily needs to move more quickly, more at, shall we say, private sector speed than public sector speed. How about that?
Sure. Yeah, that's so important. And I just want to kind of mention, so yes, spectrum auctions are certainly wonky, but this year's Nobel Prize winners in economics helped develop the theoretical framework that the FCC used. So it's kind of rare, first of all, that like an applied economic concept would win a Nobel Prize, but also something is, not on people's radar as spectrum. So that's pretty exciting, I would imagine, for people working in this space. So we have time for one more question today.
Sure.
And it's changing gears a little bit, but still on the topic of, connectivity, and specifically 5G connectivity. So more people in the country are getting behind the idea of needing a robust 5G network across the country. And surprisingly, you see some Republicans and some Democrats too start talking about the need for a national 5G network. Not national, not meaning, the whole country is connected, national meaning government led or even government developed. What do you think about this idea? And do you think it would help or hurt the kind of connectivity goals that we've been talking about?
Well, very easily, your second question, the answer is hurt. But let me unpack that a little bit. So you're right. The biggest push has been around what I will just simply call, and should be called, a nationalized telecommunication system. It's not, and to your point, it's not national meaning everyone's connected. It's nationalized meaning the government would own it. There's been a slight nuance to some. I don't think it's a nuance at all, honestly. But some have said, well, government would just build the system, and then retailers would come along and package into some interesting package for users and sell it to users. But that said, who cares? It's still a government-owned system. There are dozens of reasons why this is a poor idea. We could do an entire podcast and then some on the reasons of poor idea. Let me mention one that I think, frankly, by itself is damning, and that is there are already 3 other 5G systems built and continue to being built out in this country. They're all done in the private sector. It requires billions of dollars, billions and billions of dollars of investment. It's why communications infrastructure companies routinely top the big investor list for capital expenditures in this country. Go back and look for, I don't know, what has been like a decade or more now. They typically take if not the top spots, maybe in the top 5 or 10 spots routinely. That will continue to be the case. It takes dedication. So that is to say, once you're in, you got to be in. You and I both know, and I suspect most of your listeners know, that let's pick an egregious example. If any of us can remember back that far, if you were to walk in to a Starbucks today and it said, plug in your computer here so you can get access to our dial-up system. First of all, I'm not even sure our emails these days would come through on the dial-up system, but it would be a trickle at best of information. People would never use it. It would be effectively worthless. Government has a long history of trying to get involved in the internet space, ceasing to invest in government-owned networks and watching them fall apart. And who bears the cost of that? Well, you bear the cost as a taxpayer when it gets built. You bear the cost as a taxpayer as it gets operated. It's not free. You don't just turn on the machine and walk away. This takes lots of engineers. It takes lots of horsepower. It takes lots of energy, literally energy, electricity. All those things cost money, and they must be the bills must be paid. And then finally, in virtually every example across the country, taxpayers lose one more time when the system gets sold off for, if they're lucky, pennies on the dollar, if it doesn't just fall apart or get sold off for $1, literally, to somebody who actually can run it, private industry. That's the top line. That's only a few of the reasons this is a horrible idea. We could go down the notion of, should government even be nationalizing industry at all? I think that's an important place to be. One last thing I'll mention, because I think it does muddy the waters for some. The organization that has been interested in building this 5G system has been the Department of Defense. And so there has been some attraction, I guess, that, well, it's the military, so why wouldn't we do it? But other than some vague sense of perhaps patriotism or I love the troops, I don't know what, there is no difference between the DoD running a system. In fact, maybe it's worse when it comes to things like First Amendment, but there is no difference between the DoD running a system and any other government entity running the system. It still costs money. The taxpayers still bear the load. And let me add, particularly where the DoD is concerned, we know of real infrastructure challenges within the DoD that have not been addressed already. And one thinks that we probably should have the DoD focused on things like making sure young men and women who are enlisted have adequate housing, making sure our veterans are well cared for in state-of-the-art hospitals rather than falling apart hospitals, et cetera. It strikes me as the right place to put the attention, not building a nationalized telecommunications system.
Sure. Yeah, it sounds like a solution, and that's in scare quotes for people who don't see the video, in search of a problem. So thank you for your thoughts on that. And perhaps that's something we'll talk, in more depth about at a future time, because it's gathering surprising steam and there's a lot of angles. But unfortunately, for right now, that's all the time that we have for today. So Bartlett, can you tell our audience a good place where they can find out your work or your social media?
Sure. So recently launched a new innovation.org, so to speak, a nonprofit organization. So you can find all the information of what I'm publishing and letters and whatnot that we've signed on to at the URL is exactly the name of the organization. So www.innovationeconomyinstitute.org. And you can email me at bartlett@innovationeconomyinstitute.org, and happy to address any questions or help point you to more resources.
All right, great. Thank you so much. So once again, we have Bartlett Cleland with us on Policy Gone Viral for the James Madison Institute. And thank you all for joining us, and we will see you next time.
Thank you, ma'am.